Do you like playing Terraforming Mars against your friends but never seem to be able to clutch out the win? Then this video is exactly what you needed, because I will go over the 15 most quintessential tips to get better at Terraforming Mars. I will start with the most basic tips and work my way up in difficulty to some advanced stuff, but keep in mind, if you've already clocked in hundreds of hours online and try to play competitively, most of these tips won't be too relevant for you. And lastly, all of you who have followed my channel for a while will probably know that I have already made two similar videos quite a while back, talking about beginner mistakes. But these videos are quite old, the sound quality isn't great, and I would like to update some of the tips I gave back then, in addition to providing more tips in general. So let's get started. Tip number 1. Focus on milestones, but only if you have to. I said that I would start with the more basic tips, and what's more basic than milestones? A quintessential part of the game. They are really important in winning or losing a game of Terraforming Mars. But why? Well, a point in TM is roughly worth 5 MC. Just think about dust seals. It costs 3 MC to buy and 2 MC to play and only grants 1 VP and nothing else. Now compare that to a milestone. You pay 8 MC for 5 victory points or 1.6 MC per victory point. A much better conversion rate. But let's get to my advice regarding milestones, and it's actually 3 tips in 1. Firstly, when the game starts, take a close look at the available milestones and consider them when deciding your starting hand. You should try to at least get one of these milestones, and cards that help you get closer to claiming them increase in value because of that. In reality, milestones are even better than just 5 VP, since every milestone you get is a milestone their opponents cannot get, effectively making them 10-point swings. My second tip regarding milestones might seem like a contradiction to the first one, but it's not. You should delay claiming milestones for as long as safely possible. You know, it doesn't make a difference if you claim a milestone in Gen 1 or Gen 10, as long as you can get it. It's actually better claiming it later due to the opportunity cost. You could have just played a production card instead. I see a lot of people, especially on Hellas, claiming Rim Settler in Gen 1 due to your lucky starting hand. This is wholly unnecessary, since you can claim that milestone in Gen 2, 3 or 4 for the same effect. Just keep track of your opponent's Jovian tags and keep in mind that they can deny you Rim Settler by claiming 3 different milestones as well. And then the third tip surrounding milestones: don't overcommit to them. Again, this seems like a contradiction of the first tip, but it's just a clarification. A milestone is only 5 VP for 8 MC if you would have taken the actions needed to claim the milestone anyways. If you have to go out of your way to claim a milestone, you really have to reevaluate whether that's worth it. Let me give you 2 examples. Firstly, imagine you're in a tight race for ecologist and you have to play greenhouses without a city just to claim that milestone. Is that worth it? Well, probably. Greenhouses just cost 6 MC, and if there are no cities on the board yet, its payoff in the late game probably wouldn't have been too great anyways. But now let's think about a second scenario, where you would have to SP a city for mayor. That's a completely different story. An SP city is incredibly expensive, and considering the fact that you already most likely have 2 cities on the board, probably not worth it on its own. That transforms the 10 VP swing for 8 MC to a 10 VP swing for 33 MC. That's a massive difference. Now, I don't say that play is never worth it, but it should be carefully considered. Tip number 2. Don't always 2 action, or the art of sequencing. Keep in mind that when it's your turn, you have the ability to choose whether you want to do 1 or 2 actions. There are merits to both. For example, if you want to play a power production card and then follow it up with a power hungry card, you always want to do that in the same go to avoid getting tapped in between. But to me, it seems like especially newer players often miss the situations where it would have been beneficial to do only 1 action. Let me give you some examples for when it might be a good idea to do only 1 action. First of all, global bonus bumps. Let's say you have 24 heat and the temperature scale is at -6 degrees Celsius. You cannot convert all of your heat to get the bonus ocean in one go. It might be beneficial to do just 1 action at a time and not take any heat bumps to try and stall out your opponent. Then you can freely do your heat bumps and claim that free ocean. There are related situations to this. Let's say you have 16 heat, demos on hand, and the temperature is at minus 10 degrees Celsius. Then the best course of action probably is to take one heat conversion, then skip, and take the second one and play demos in one go afterwards. That way you give your opponent the worst chance of getting that bonus ocean himself, since you leave him at minus 8 degrees. If you had taken 2 heat bumps immediately, or even worse, played demos and a heat bump, he could have taken the bonus much easier himself. A second reason to one action are instant plans and the following conversion. You might say, what? That makes no sense. If I get instant plans that get me up to 8, I want to immediately follow that up with a conversion. Well, yeah, that's true, but sometimes you have multiple cards that grant instant plans. For example, an ocean card followed up by kelp farming. If those two get you up to 8 combined, you would want to play the ocean first, then skip, then play kelp and convert. That way you risk only 6 plans to an asteroid instead of 8. Basically, you can sort these situations into 2 groups. Firstly, situations in which you want to stall out your opponent by doing only one action at a time. This means that you do multiple one action goes in a row. And then secondly, situations where you want to link together 2 actions, but need to take a third one before that. And then one last tip, keep in mind that you can set up plays for the next generation as well. Imagine you enter generation with 0 plans, 4 plant prod, and you have optimal air braking and towing a comet on hand, but not enough money to play them both this gen. The optimal sequence here is to play optimal arrow braking as your last action of the generation, and then open the next gen with towing into a conversion. That way you get all of the benefits of optimal arrow braking, but also get to safely convert your greenery. Tip number 3. Forget about cities. Too many newer players think cities are the way to go all the time. Believe me, even if I'm going for a ground game, meaning placing a lot of greeneries, I don't necessarily want to place a lot of cities as well. Why? Well, first of all, no matter if you're playing city cards or using the standard project, cities are expensive. And considering a card like Cupola City, you have to factor in the power production as well. For their price, these cards, and especially the City Standard project, don't grant a lot of development. Again, compare Cupola to Acquired Company. If we assume the cost of power prod is roughly 7 MC, then you're paying 13 MC more for the same development. That means the rest of the city's price needs to be justified by getting points. But greeneries are often much better at that job than cities. If the oxygen is not maxed out yet, a greenery on its own yields 2 points. That means a city would need to border 3 greeneries to be worth more. If you already have a city on the board where you can place your greeneries next to, that greenery is worth 3 points, meaning a new city would need to score 4 points to be worth more. You see where I'm going. This is a reason for why Tharsis Republic is so strong with newer players and kinda average with more experienced ones. New players love placing cities and Tharsis profits off of that. But when are cities actually good? That's something I will touch on in tip number 7. Tip number 4. Embrace greeneries. Or what the hell is an ocean walk? I just talked about why I think a lot of new players are overvaluing cities and undervaluing greeneries. Now I want to go more into the second part and explain what is called an ocean walk. Greeneries and oceans go hand in hand. You can place oceans on the board and pick up plant placement bonuses, and then convert these plants to place greeneries next to these oceans, and get an MC rebate, which will allow you to play more ocean cards. That's the Terraforming Mars circle of life, or what we call an ocean walk, since you walk along the edge of the oceans with your greenery placements. This tactic of course relies on getting some plant production, and is best if you get good ocean placing cards like towing a comet or imported hydrogen as well. But if you can pull it off, it grants a lot of points, some development at the same time, and at least partly pays for itself. It's so good that even if I have placed a city at the start of the game, maybe with a prelude or just because research outpost is so busted, I will most likely not place my greeneries next to it and go for an ocean walk instead. But why do I do that? Well, for most of the game, points are not worth a damn thing. They are only counted once Mars is fully terraformed. Because of this, I rather take MC and plant placement bonuses during the game, which allow me to play more cards and place more greeneries, and then try to fill up the spots surrounding my cities later. And due to what we have learned in tip number 3, we don't even have that many cities that we need to surround. Tip number 5. All you need to know about drafting. Of course, you can play Terraforming Mars without drafting, but in my opinion that's a straight up crime. Drafting eliminates a lot of luck from the game and introduces a whole new strategical element. The most important thing to realize when drafting is that you're not only drafting your own cards, but your opponent's cards as well. Don't only consider what you would like to take from the first cards, also think about what your opponent would want for their game. Maybe you'd like to take a Jovian multiplier since you're set on systems and have played asteroid mining in Gen 1. But do you want to pass insects to your opponent who is playing Ecoline and has played Arctic algae and lichen already? These draft scenarios come in all kinds of different flavors. Probably the easiest case is when you're not sure whether you'd like to keep any of the offered cards anyways. If they're just alright or even straight up worthless for you, you might as well just cut a card that your opponent would really like. If you really like a card out of the 4 offered, but feel that you need to cut another one, you have to think about a variety of different things first. Firstly, if you're playing with more than just one opponent, are you even passing towards the player that you don't want the card to get to? If not, then maybe you can just pass on the burden of cutting that great card to the next player. Secondly, think about what you can do with the card you're cutting and what your opponent can do with the card he's going to get instead. Let's say you'd love to take NRA because you have 3 plant tags already, but feel like you need to cut Ganymede Colony from your opponent with 4 Jovian tags instead. Is that opponent going to be able to make use of NRA as well? Because then you can just suck it up, keep NRA and pass that damn mold. At least if you have no use for it. And lastly, again when playing with more than one opponent, keeping cards that benefit you is generally better than cutting cards that help only one opponent. In the case where you get a good card, but also one of your opponents will get a good card since you haven't cut it, that makes you still better off than that 3rd, 4th or even 5th player you're playing with, and you need to score better than them all. If you're cutting that one card and can't make use of it, you're better off than no one, even if you've denied one opponent a great card. Tip number 6. Terraforming Mars is a game of combos. When explaining the intricacies of drafting, I talked about a lot of certain combo cards. NRA or Ganymede Colony, for example. But there are many more than just those 2, cards that rely on other cards to be good. Terraforming Mars actually is a game full of combos and synergies, some easier to spot and some less easy. There are cards with high tag requirements, mostly science tags like AGT or Mass Converter. There are cards that only get good if you have a few of the required tags, like insects or cartel. And there are cards that are only good if a certain global parameter is met fast enough, like Methane from Titan or Lake Marineris. Get familiar with these cards and think about whether you want to pass them in the draft. This also applies the other way around. Not only the payoff can be denied, but the prerequisite as well. So for example, be mindful of passing science tags if your opponent is playing slow and is hoarding cards, even if you don't know whether he has a science combo card on hand. Be mindful of passing a Jovian tag if your opponent has some titanium prot and card draw, even if he hasn't played a Jovian himself yet. And lastly, not every combo is worth going after. Just because you played a few power tags, don't think Power Grid is suddenly worth playing. It might be, but most likely you have already more than enough power prot from all these power tags earlier. Just because you have extreme cold fungus on hand, nitrate reducing bacteria isn't suddenly great. These cards cost a lot of money to get down and don't grant you that much in return. And just because you have played optimal arrow breaking, AAA isn't suddenly worth playing, it's still atrocious. Tip number 7. Engine and rush, or playing fast and slow. I wanted to start off today's list of tips with some low-hanging fruit. Some easy to avoid mistakes, or some easy to pick up things to improve on. But I've already talked a bit about playing slow or fast in some of these tips, and that's a topic that I need to discuss even more deeply, as it's one of the most important concepts in the entire game. When playing Terraforming Mars, you constantly need to ask yourself the following question. Who wants the game to end? The answer to that question is incredibly important. Points are only counted at the end of the game, and it doesn't matter if you were ahead in points for 99% of the game if your opponent catches up in the last gen. So how to determine who wants the game to end? Generally, there are two main strategies in Terraforming Mars: rush and engine. Rush players want to, well, rush through the game, score a lot of points quickly by terraforming a lot, and then end the game fast. For a rush player, the game needs to end fast, because otherwise the engine player has enough time to set up their economic engine and catch up in points. But how do we determine who is rushing and who is playing engine? Because sometimes that's not clear cut and easy to understand. Well, there are some indicators. If your opponent is investing heavily into MC, steel and titanium prod, as well as card draw, that's a good indicator that he's going for an engine setup. There are other indicators like hoarding cards to try and go for planner or playing Jovian tags. Of course, this observation also works the other way around. If your starting hand includes a lot of these pieces, so MC, steel and titanium prod, card draw and Jovians, you should probably yourself go for an engine. A rush, however, can be spotted by an early investment into space events and tile placements to try and convert plants into greeneries, a lot of heat production and few hand cards. The same rule applies here. If you spot some of these pieces in your starting hand, you should try and commit to a rush. But now let's get back to the starting question. Who wants the game to end and why is this so important? Let's say you draw Giant Ice Asteroid, unquestionably one of the absolute best cards in the entire game. You'd always want to play that, right? Well, no. First you have to ask yourself, who wants the game to end? Is it your opponent? Maybe he's playing Ecoline with a lot of heat and plant prod and has claimed Terraformer and Gardener. He placed a ton of greeneries and has 20 more TR than you. Meanwhile, you have set up a great engine with Earthcat and AI, but haven't played a lot of your point cards yet. Sure, that GIA would score 4 points and maybe deny Ecoline 1 greenery. But it would probably also let the game end at least one generation sooner, giving you less time to catch up to your opponent's early point lead. Terraforming or rush strategies usually run out of steam at some point, while engine strategies, especially those with some card draw, get stronger and stronger the longer the game goes on. That GIA example is very drastic, but decisions like this come up in every game of Terraforming Mars in various shapes and sizes. Do you play carbonate processing early on, or do you play sponsors? Do you play AI or Ice Asteroid? Do you fund another award, or SP a greenery to end the game? Always ask yourself, do I benefit from ending the game sooner, or stalling it out one more gen? And to answer this question, use the indicators I provided you with earlier. Card draw and production indicate an engine strategy, while heat prod, plant prod, and space events indicate rush. And with this knowledge, we can also finally answer the question I teased in tip 3. When do you actually want to place a lot of cities? Cities score points without contributing to ending the game, but they also mostly score less efficient than straight up point cards, unless you have a lot of plant prod and can surround most of your cities with greeneries. But greeneries, on the other hand, do contribute to ending the game. So while cities are more akin to an engine strat, greeneries do fit better into a rush. If the temperature lags behind the oxygen track, this mismatch is no problem though. Because then, cities get much better and much more important for scoring, since you have more time to surround the cities with greeneries, and the greeneries themselves score less efficiently without the cities due to them not granting any more oxygen bumps. But that should be everything about playing fast and slow for now, so let's move on to the next tip. Tip number 8. Learn when to save your money. After covering game tempo and when to play fast or slow, we can now get back to simpler tips. And with the first one, I want to tell you that there are many situations in which you should save your money. Not everything has to be played immediately. Not playing cards gives you more flexibility in the next gen to possibly play better cards that you could pick up in the next draft. For some cards, this is easier to understand than for others. Even most newcomers understand that pure point cards like breathing filters should never be played ahead of the last gen unless there's a very good reason for it. For example, if you need tech to get a strong combo card down like AGT or NRA, or to secure a milestone. For other cards, the decision whether to play them or save the money can be trickier. Think about instant card draw like research or business contacts. You might think the sooner I get the info and additional cards, the earlier I can make use of them. While that's true, you should first think about how likely it is that you draw an immediately useful card that can be played with your remaining money. And secondly, keep in mind that a lot of instant card draw can be improved by combo cards. Also, there are a lot of situations where you are waiting just one more combo piece to get a real powerhouse down, which means that you should probably just save your cash and hope for the draft. Let's say you have NRA on hand, 2 plant tags played, but lack the third one. Instead of spending all of your money on development or whatever, you should maybe just save your cash, hope to get a plant tag in the draft, and then get NRA down. If you get a bit lucky, this play would pay off massively. And if you get unlucky, you've just missed one turn of production and then can reevaluate the situation again. Tip number 9. When to use standard projects. In Terraforming Mars, you'll learn pretty quickly how inefficient standard projects are. Take Power Plant for example. Funnily enough, there's a card with the exact same name that also grants 1 power prod, and not only is 4 MC cheaper if bought in the draft, but it also grants 2 tags and can be paid for with steel. If you need power prod to get a card down, the standard project needs to be the absolute last resort. A card like Building Industries takes a whole generation longer to pay off if you use the SP over the card, for example. With the other standard projects, you'll notice similar patterns. SP Aquifer costs 4 more than Subterranean Reservoir, and that card can be improved by Media Group or IC. SP Greenery costs 5 MC more than Plantation, and while that card has a 2 science requirement, it also holds probably the best tag in the game. With each of these standard projects, you'll need a very good reason to use them. Maybe an SP Greenery to get from 6 to 8 plants and then convert and claim Gardener. Or you have Arctic Algae down, 4 plants and kelp farming on hand. Due to kelp, you already want to get oceans down as fast as possible, and with the Arctic Algae effect, the ocean will even let you convert, granting you that oxygen TR 1 gen sooner and protecting your plants from asteroids. Also, Standard Tag is another great card that should never be underestimated. If you are going for a rush, meaning that you want the game to end as fast as possible, something that I explained in tip 7, then Standard Tag is one of the best cards in the game. Why? In a rush, you'll need to somehow balance your ability to increase all terraforming parameters at roughly the same speed, since you need to max them all out to end the game. If the cards you get in the draft do not line up perfectly for that, Standard Tech can help you balance that out. Maybe you get an insane amount of heat and plant prod, but don't find any good space events to place oceans. With Standard Tech, you can now get oceans down for 15 MC instead of 18, making them nearly as cheap as oceans placed by Subterranean Reservoir. It's just an enormously powerful tool to end the game with. And lastly, I want to touch on cities again. I already discussed why cities are incredibly inefficient development-wise, and are outclassed by greeneries when it comes to point scoring most of the time. And well, a standard project happens to be the most expensive way of placing a city. Tip number 10. How many cards is too many cards? I often say that cards are the most limited resource in the game. If you don't get any card draw, you'll only see the 4 cards in the draft each gen. So naturally you want to buy as many of them as possible, right? I see a lot of newer players following this mindset, and I have to admit, I'm also guilty of overbuying in a lot of games. So what is overbuying and why is it bad? At the start of each gen, you should ask yourself, what cards do I really want to play this gen, and how many cards can I pick up and still be able to do that? Of course, sometimes you'll find insanely good cards in the draft and need to delay some cards for a gen, because you really need to pick up these game-changing cards. But keep in mind that especially pure production cards do get worse the more you delay them, and at some point are just not worth playing anymore. Finding a good balance between picking up good cards in the draft and actually playing enough cards to perform your game plan is quite hard and requires a lot of experience. There are a few general rules though. Firstly, every card you buy that remains on your hand after the game ends is a card you overbought. That's easy. Of course, there are exceptions though. Sometimes your game plan changes during the game and cards become irrelevant, but try to ask yourself, will I realistically play this card before the game ends? Are there other cards that I want to play first that will delay this card, and is it still worth it then? The second rule, and this is related to the first one, is that the number of cards you should pick up optimally often relies on the speed of the game and your game plan specifically. In a slow game that goes until Gen 12, you have a lot of time to play cards and you'll probably be quite rich by the end. This means you'll want a lot of cards, such that you're not forced to use standard projects by the end of the game. In contrast, if you're rushing or the game is just going fast in general, you want to pick up less cards, such that you're able to play them at the right time. It's not worth picking up a lot of production cards if you cannot play them early on. Tip number 11. Know the F tier cards, but also know when to use them. Everyone knows that card quality is one of the most important aspects of Terraforming Mars. Of course, you need to know which cards are overpowered, but I feel like newcomers learn what the strongest cards are quite quickly. Earthcat and AI Central feel game-breaking, even after just using them in one game. Bad cards are often harder to spot. I can advise you to check out my video series, Rating Base Game Cards, where I go over all cards, talk about them, their best use cases, when to avoid them, and how to handle them in the draft. And I also place them in a big old tier list in an Excel sheet that is linked in the description of each video. Of course, there's an F tier, and it will surprise absolutely no one who has played Terraforming Mars more than 5 times that cards like Underground Detonations, Aerobraked Ammonia Asteroid or Security Fleet can be found down there. It's important to know why these cards are so bad, because then you can spot similar cards and judge if they're bad as well. But most importantly, you can find the few scenarios where these cards actually make sense to play. I've uploaded some gameplay videos where I use these cards to some effect, and maybe these will help you understand when overpowered cards can actually be worth it. So you should better know which cards are horrendous, but you should also know when they just might be playable. Tip number 12. Have fun and experiment. Especially if you're new to the game, your main focus should be to have fun while playing it and to experiment while playing it as much as possible. You got dealt that new corp that you have never played before? Try it out. You got an interesting starting combo, but you don't know how strong it is? Go for it. Only by trying out new cards, combos and strategies you will really get better at the game. When I get a new expansion, I always play with the new corps exclusively for a while and try to play as many new cards as possible to get a feel for them and the new mechanics. Also, that's what I will be doing when Prelude 2 comes out as well. I'm really looking forward to that. These 12 tips cover general rules for every game of Terraforming Mars. Next up, I want to cover some of the most important topics with regards to the expansions. Tip number 13. Be careful when playing Venus Next. There are 3 things to be careful about when playing Venus Next. First of all, don't assume that Venus is terraformed at all. If you pick up cards that rely on the Venus track, but you don't terraform Venus yourself at all, don't assume that the other players will do it. There will be plenty of games where the new parameter won't be terraformed at all, since it's not required to be maxed out for the game to end, at least when you're playing with regular rules. Secondly, be careful about the new cards. Card quality in this new deck is generally pretty weak, and while you will probably want to check out all the new cards at least once, just know that there are some absolute shitters in there. Especially some of the floater cards are quite weak, same as the few heat and plant producing cards. At the same time, you should make yourself familiar with the few top tier cards in this deck. Some are easy to spot, since they're just great value, like Atalanta Planitia Lab for example. But some are more difficult to evaluate, without experience with Venus Next. There are some insane combos that can be pulled off with cards like Stratospheric Birds, Venusian Animals, Freya Biodomes, Venusian Plants and Maxwell Base. If you see these in the draft, try to gauge how fast the game is going, and if you or your opponent could still make use of them, since they are very dangerous when combined. Thirdly, be careful about game length. I just noticed game length, and there are 2 points to make about it when discussing Venus Next. Firstly, regular Venus Next games without the solar phase take longer on average. Why? Well, there's one more thing to do to score points that does not help with ending the game. And also, almost none of the new cards are efficient at terraforming the regular 3 tracks. This fact makes long game strategies, especially centered around science, stronger, which also combos well with some of the best Venus Next cards. Secondly, if you're playing with solar phase, the game very well might be insanely fast. All players agree on rushing, and they are also using the solar phase on oxygen, temperature or oceans, the game could be over in 6 gens. Also keep in mind that you can set up your next turn with the solar phase, but you should do so carefully. You can increase the temperature to -8 degrees, and then next gen play demos and take another heat bump for the bonus ocean. But since you're always performing the solar phase when you're first player, that also means that you'll be last player the gen afterwards, so that bump can get stolen. So be careful when playing with Venus next. Tip number 14. The Power of Colonies. When colonies are introduced to the game, Terraforming Mars changes fundamentally. You now have a standard project-like way to get specific resources without relying on drawing the right cards. You want steel? Trade with Ceres. You got stratospheric birds down early and want to stack as many animals on it as possible? Trade with Miranda. In most games, Pluto is probably the most impactful colony. In the base game, you need to get really lucky and draw into cards like Restricted Area or Development Center early on to get continuous card draw. With colonies, you're nearly guaranteed to be able to at least place a colony on Pluto with the standard project, and wham! 1 Mars U activation per gen. If you then also get 3 power prot and can trade there every other gen, you will end up with way more cards than usually. But the thing is, this mechanic is available to anyone in the game. Getting a lot of card draw in the base game is often an asymmetric thing. One player gets some card draw early on and then draws into more, since he sees a lot more cards. If Pluto is in the game, everyone can draw many more cards than usual. And that's one reason why colonies games often take longer than games without the expansion. Also, in general, this expansion changes the values of cards. Power prot suddenly is the best thing in the game. Titanium prot becomes more valuable since colonies introduces a few really good space tags, and as I said, card draw is less impactful if Pluto is available. And then there are the colony cards. Some of these are just busted, like Research Colony or Spaceport Colony. Having the ability to trade twice is also insanely strong. So all in all, what do I want to say with all of this? Well, if you got the impression that you can just ignore the new gameplay mechanics and still be fine by playing Venus next, don't think the same thing when checking out colonies for the first time. These new mechanics are game changing and ignoring them is probably detrimental to your game. Tip number 15. Plan ahead when playing with Turmoil. The Turmoil expansion introduces the new global events, which can be quite impactful to your game, both positively and negatively. The good thing about them is that you can see them coming and can do everything in your power to either benefit more of the positive effects or avoid negative effects as much as possible. If you see mudslides on the horizon, then think twice about whether you want to place your greeneries next to oceans. If there is diversity coming up and you need one more tag to get to 9, then you can definitely play a card that you would have otherwise delayed for a few more gens. The 10 MC reward makes it worth it. And of course, often you can influence the effects with, well, influence. If there is a really impactful event in second position, try to get elected as Senate leader, so you have one more influence in the following gen. This, together with the 2 influence you can get from the dominant party, can have large implications. But that was it. Do you disagree with some of these tips, or do you have other tips for playing Terraforming Mars? Then leave a comment and we can discuss. And if you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, please leave a like and consider subscribing. It greatly helps me out. And lastly, please check out my Twitch and my Twitter, which are linked in the description. I hope I see you in the next video.